Sarah Martinez wiped down the coffee counter for the third time that morning, her movements precise and efficient, despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. The small cafe in downtown San Diego buzzed with the usual morning rush of office workers and tourists, their chatter mixing with the hiss of the espresso machine. At 28, Sarah had calluses on her hands that told two very different stories, some from gripping a rifle in the mountains of Afghanistan, others from endless hours behind this very counter. The transition from military life to civilian work had been harder than any mission she'd ever completed. After 8 years as a Navy SEAL, including 3 tours overseas, Sarah found herself struggling to find employment that matched her skills and experience. Despite her exemplary service record, her Medal of Valor, and her expertise in combat operations, most employers seemed unable to see past the fact that she was a woman who had served in what they still considered a man's job. "Excuse me, miss," a sharp voice cut through her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see a woman in an expensive business suit, tapping manicured nails impatiently on the counter. "I ordered my latte 10 minutes ago. This is completely unacceptable." Sarah glanced at the order ticket. It had been placed just 3 minutes ago. "I apologize for the wait. Your drink will be ready in just a moment." She moved to the espresso machine, her military training keeping her voice calm and professional, despite the customer's obvious attempt to create a scene. The woman huffed loudly, making sure everyone in the cafe could hear her displeasure. "This is exactly what's wrong with hiring people like you for real jobs. No work ethic, no sense of urgency. You're probably just waiting for some man to come along and take care of you." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she continued preparing the drink. Around the cafe, other customers began to take notice of the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed to be enjoying the drama unfolding at the counter. "Furthermore," the woman continued, her voice rising, "I don't understand why they don't hire qualified people for these positions, someone who actually understands customer service and professionalism." She gestured dismissively at Sarah's simple uniform and pulled back hair. Sarah finished the latte with practiced precision, creating a perfect heart design in the foam. She placed it gently on the counter, her movements betraying none of the irritation she felt. "Here's your latte, ma'am. I hope you enjoy it." The woman snatched the cup without acknowledgement and turned to address the growing audience in the cafe. "You see what I mean? No pride in their work, no real skills. These people think they can just coast through life without any real accomplishments." At a corner table, an elderly man in a crisp military uniform quietly observed the exchange. General Robert Hayes had stopped in for his usual morning coffee before heading to the naval base for a ceremony honoring recent Medal of Valor recipients. Something about the young woman behind the counter caught his attention, the way she carried herself, the controlled composure under pressure, and most importantly, the subtle flash of metal on her right hand. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to adjust her ring, a simple band that meant everything to her, but appeared meaningless to everyone else in the civilian world. The trident insignia was small, understated, but it represented years of the most grueling training imaginable and service in some of the world's most dangerous places. The businesswoman continued her tirade, now addressing her friend who had joined her. "I just don't understand why these coffee shops can't find better help. Look at her. Probably never accomplished anything meaningful in her entire life. Just standing there taking orders like some kind of robot." Sarah's military training had taught her to remain calm under pressure far more intense than an angry customer. But the words stung more than she cared to admit. After risking her life for her country, after proving herself in the most elite military unit in the world, she found herself serving coffee to people who saw her as nothing more than an unskilled worker. General Hayes stood up from his table, his coffee finished and his patience with the scene exhausted. He had seen enough disrespect for one morning, and something told him there was much more to this young woman than met the eye. As he approached the counter, he noticed Sarah's posture straighten slightly, a subtle change that only someone with military experience would recognize. The cafe had grown quieter as more people became aware of the confrontation. Sarah continued working, taking orders from other customers and maintaining her professional demeanor, but the general could see the tension in her shoulders and the controlled breathing that spoke of someone fighting to maintain composure. What happened next would change everything for Sarah Martinez. Though she had no way of knowing it as she prepared another customer's order, her seal ring catching the morning light streaming through the cafe windows. General Hayes approached the counter with the measured steps of someone accustomed to command. The businesswoman was still holding court near the pickup area, regaling her friend with complaints about modern work ethics and the decline of customer service standards. Her voice carried across the small cafe as she gestured dramatically with her free hand. "I mean, really, what kind of future does someone like that have?" she said, glancing back at Sarah with obvious disdain. "Probably bounce from one minimum wage job to another for the rest of her life. No ambition, no real skills to speak of." Sarah's hands remained steady as she worked the espresso machine, but those who knew what to look for could see the subtle signs of controlled anger. The slight tension in her jaw, the way her breathing had become more measured and deliberate. These were techniques drilled into every SEAL during training. Methods for maintaining operational effectiveness under extreme stress. The general waited patiently in line, studying Sarah's movements with growing interest. Her efficiency behind the counter was impressive, but it was the small details that caught his military eye. The way she scanned the room periodically, maintaining situational awareness. How she kept her workspace organized with almost military precision. The fact that despite the ongoing harassment, she never once lost her composure or responded with anything less than professionalism. When it was his turn to order, General Hayes stepped forward and spoke in the clear, authoritative voice that had commanded respect in boardrooms and battlefields around the world. "Good morning. I'll have a black coffee, please." Sarah looked up and immediately noticed the uniform, the insignia, the bearing of a career military officer. Something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite standing at attention, but showing the subtle respect one service member gives to another, even in civilian settings. "Yes, sir." "Will that be a large?" she asked, her voice carrying just a hint of the crisp efficiency she'd perfected during her years of service. "Large will be perfect, thank you." The general's eyes moved deliberately to her hands as she reached for a cup, and he caught sight of what he'd been looking for, the unmistakable trident insignia on her ring. His expression didn't change, but internally, pieces began falling into place. Behind him, the businesswoman's voice rose again. "See what I mean? She's practically falling asleep on her feet. Probably stays out too late partying instead of taking her responsibilities seriously. These young people have no concept of real work or real sacrifice." Sarah's hand tightened briefly on the coffee pot, but she continued pouring with steady precision. The general watched this display of self-control with growing admiration and increasing anger at the ongoing commentary. "That'll be $3.50, Sarah said, setting the cup on the counter. As the general reached for his wallet, he made sure his voice carried clearly across the cafe. "Tell me, what's your background before working here?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, unsure how much to share. "I served in the military, sir, Navy." "How long?" 8 years. The businesswoman snorted loudly from across the cafe. "Oh, here we go. Probably filed paperwork at some desk job and now thinks she's a hero. These military wannabes are all the same. Can't handle real civilian work, so they make up stories about their service." The general's eyes hardened, but he kept his focus on Sarah. "What was your rating?" Sarah straightened slightly, pride flickering in her eyes despite the hostile environment. "Special warfare operator, sir." A hush fell over the immediate area around the counter. Several customers who had been half listening to the conversation suddenly paid closer attention. Special warfare operator was not a rating most people recognized, but those who did know what it meant. The general nodded slowly, his respect for the young woman before him growing by the moment. "Where did you serve?" "Afghanistan, sir. 3 tours." Sarah's voice remained steady, professional, but there was something in her eyes now, a quiet dignity that had been missing moments before. The businesswoman, oblivious to the significance of what she was hearing, continued her critique. "Afghanistan, please." Probably worked in the mess hall or did laundry. Now she's trying to make herself sound important, to cover for the fact that she can't even make coffee properly. The general placed a $20 bill on the counter for his $3.50 coffee and looked directly into Sarah's eyes. "Keep the change. And thank you for your service." He paused, his voice gaining an edge that made several nearby customers look up sharply. "Real service. The kind most people can't even imagine." Sarah nodded, accepting the thanks with the quiet grace of someone who had learned not to expect much recognition for her sacrifices. "Thank you, sir." But the general wasn't finished. He turned slowly to face the rest of the cafe, his bearing suddenly commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The businesswoman was still talking to her friend, completely unaware that the dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. What she didn't realize was that General Hayes had just confirmed something that would change her perspective entirely if she had been smart enough to listen. General Hayes stood at the counter for a moment longer, his coffee in hand as he made a decision that would ripple through the small cafe like a stone dropped in still water. The businesswoman continued her commentary, apparently energized by what she mistakenly believed was support for her position. "You see," she said to her companion, gesturing toward Sarah, "even the military doesn't want people like her anymore. That's why she's stuck making coffee. Probably got kicked out for not being able to handle the pressure." The general's jaw tightened. In his 35 years of military service, he had encountered every type of soldier imaginable, but few had impressed him as much as the young woman now quietly cleaning the espresso machine behind the counter. He had read her file just 3 weeks ago as part of his preparation for today's medal ceremony. Sarah Martinez wasn't just any Navy veteran. She was one of the most decorated female SEALs in recent history. He turned to face the room, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing large groups. "Excuse me, everyone. I'd like to have your attention for just a moment." The cafe fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips, and even the businesswoman finally stopped talking. There was something about the general's presence that commanded immediate respect, something that made it clear this was not a request. "I couldn't help but overhear some comments about the young woman working behind this counter," he began, his eyes sweeping the room. Comments about her lack of skills, her work ethic, and her accomplishments. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear, to avoid whatever was about to happen. In her years of service, she had learned to blend in, to let her actions speak louder than words. This kind of attention was the last thing she wanted. The general continued, his voice growing stronger. "I think there are some things you should know about the person serving your coffee this morning." He moved closer to Sarah, who was now standing very still behind the counter, her training keeping her composed despite her discomfort. This woman graduated in the top 5% of one of the most grueling training programs in the world, a program that has a failure rate of over 70%, a program that most men can't complete. The businesswoman's friend tugged at her sleeve, sensing that something significant was happening, but the businesswoman brushed her off, still convinced that this was some kind of exaggeration or mistake. During her first tour in Afghanistan, the general continued, Petty Officer Martinez was part of a team that rescued 12 hostages from a Taliban compound. She personally carried a wounded teammate to safety under heavy enemy fire, refusing medical evacuation until everyone else was secure. The cafe was now completely silent, except for the general's voice. Sarah's face had gone pale and she shook her head slightly, trying to signal him to stop. She had never wanted her service record to be public knowledge, especially not like this. But the general was just getting started. On her second tour, she led a reconnaissance mission that provided intelligence crucial to disrupting a major terrorist supply line. The operation she planned and executed saved an estimated 200 civilian lives. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The businesswoman's expression had changed from smug certainty to growing confusion and concern. Her third tour, the general's voice rose slightly, involved a mission so classified that I can't discuss the details even now. What I can tell you is that her actions during that mission earned her the Medal of Valor, the third highest decoration for courage in combat that this country can bestow. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the sudden exposure of things she had worked hard to keep private. The Medal of Valor was indeed one of the highest honors possible, awarded only to those who demonstrated exceptional courage in the face of extreme danger. The general reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. In fact, Petty Officer Martinez is supposed to be at the naval base this morning, receiving recognition at a ceremony honoring Medal of Valor recipients. A ceremony that I am conducting as the base commander. He looked directly at Sarah, his expression softening slightly. I was wondering why you weren't there, and now I understand. You're here, working to support yourself while you transition to civilian life, enduring insults from people who have never sacrificed anything more significant than their morning latte. The businesswoman's face had gone completely white. Her friend was staring at her in horror, finally understanding the magnitude of what had just happened. Around the cafe, other customers were looking between Sarah and the general, processing the dramatic revelation that had just unfolded. Sarah finally found her voice, though it was quieter than usual. "Sir, I couldn't afford to take time off work. The ceremony was an honor, but I need this job." The general nodded, understanding more than she knew about the challenges faced by veterans transitioning to civilian life. But he wasn't finished with his revelation, and the businesswoman was about to learn just how wrong she had been about the simple coffee shop worker she had been insulting. The silence in the cafe stretched for what felt like an eternity. The businesswoman stood frozen, her expensive latte growing cold in her trembling hands as the full weight of her earlier words crashed down on her. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every assumption she had made about Sarah's character and accomplishments now hung in the air like toxic smoke. General Hayes wasn't finished. He turned his attention directly to the businesswoman, his voice taking on the steel edge that had made him legendary among his subordinates. "Ma'am, I believe you had some opinions about this young woman's qualifications and work ethic." The woman opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her face had progressed from white to a deep crimson as she realized that everyone in the cafe was now staring at her. Her friend had taken several steps away, clearly wanting to distance herself from the unfolding disaster. "You said she had no real skills." The general continued relentlessly. "Let me tell you about her real skills. She's fluent in 3 languages. She's an expert marksman who can hit a target at over 1,000 yards. She's trained in advanced medical techniques that have saved lives in combat zones. She can navigate by stars, survive in hostile environments for weeks with minimal supplies, and plan complex operations involving multiple teams and sophisticated equipment." With each qualification he listed, the businesswoman seemed to shrink smaller. Other customers were now openly shaking their heads at her, and several were pulling out their phones to record what had become a viral moment in the making. Sarah stood behind the counter, overwhelmed by the unexpected defense of her character and accomplishments. She had grown so accustomed to hiding her military background, to downplaying her service to avoid uncomfortable questions or skeptical reactions, that having it proclaimed so proudly felt almost surreal. The general reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, placing it on the counter in front of Sarah. "Petty Officer Martinez, I'd like to offer you a position as a civilian contractor with the Department of Defense. We need people with your experience and integrity to train the next generation of special operations personnel." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline. Sarah looked down at the card, then back up at the general, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. A job that would use her skills, that would value her experience, that would pay her what she was actually worth. It seemed too good to be true. "The position comes with full benefits, a salary commensurate with your experience and qualifications, and the respect you've earned, but haven't been receiving," the general added. "You'd be working with active duty SEALs, sharing the knowledge and experience that took you 8 years and 3 combat deployments to acquire." The businesswoman finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I'm sorry, The general turned to face her again, his expression showing no mercy. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You made assumptions based on what you saw on the surface, without taking a moment to consider that there might be more to this person than met your eye." He gestured around the cafe, where other customers were now openly glaring at the woman. "This young woman has risked her life for your freedom, for your right to sit in this cafe and drink overpriced coffee while complaining about the service. She's seen things you can't imagine, done things you couldn't do, and sacrificed more than you'll ever understand." The woman's friend finally found the courage to speak. "Come on, Linda, we should go." She tugged at the businesswoman's arm, clearly desperate to escape the increasingly hostile environment. But the general wasn't quite finished with his lesson. "Before you leave," he said, his voice carrying across the cafe, "I want you to understand something. The person you spent 20 minutes insulting and belittling is a genuine American hero. She's the kind of person who runs toward danger, while others run away from it. She's someone who puts the lives of others before her own safety, who serves without recognition or glory." He paused, letting his words sink in, not just to the businesswoman, but to everyone in the cafe. "The next time you encounter someone in a service job, Someone you think you can dismiss or look down upon, remember this moment. Remember that you have no idea what that person has done, what they've sacrificed, or what they're capable of. Sarah looked around the cafe, seeing the faces of strangers who now looked at her with respect instead of indifference. The transformation was almost overwhelming. For months she had felt invisible, reduced to nothing more than a uniform and a name tag. Now suddenly she was seen for who she really was. The businesswoman nodded frantically, tears starting to form in her eyes as the full impact of her behavior hit her. She had publicly humiliated herself while trying to humiliate someone far better than she could ever hope to be. But the morning's revelations weren't quite over. The general had one more surprise that would complete Sarah's transformation from invisible coffee server to recognized hero. The businesswoman hurried toward the exit, her friend trailing behind. But the damage to her reputation was already spreading beyond the cafe walls. Several customers had indeed been recording the encounter, and within minutes, videos of her humiliation were being shared across social media platforms. The hashtag #CoffeeShopKaren would trend for the next 3 days, though she wouldn't discover this until much later. As the door closed behind them, the atmosphere in the cafe began to shift dramatically. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation was transforming into something entirely different. Customers who had been silent observers were now approaching the counter, wanting to speak with Sarah personally. An elderly man who had been sitting quietly in the corner stood up and walked over. "Miss, I want to thank you for your service. My son was in the army, deployed to Iraq twice. I know how hard it is for you folks when you come home." He placed a $20 bill in the tip jar. "This doesn't seem like nearly enough, but it's what I can do." A young mother with 2 small children approached next. "I'm sorry people treated you that way. My husband is deployed right now, and I know how much you all sacrifice for us." Her children, who had been listening to their mother explain what was happening, both drew pictures on napkins and handed them to Sarah, crude crayon drawings of American flags with "Thank you" written in shaky letters. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as more customers came forward, each wanting to express their gratitude and respect. For so long she had felt disconnected from the civilian world, like an outsider who didn't quite fit anywhere. Now, surrounded by people who finally understood her worth, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since leaving the Navy. General Hayes watched this outpouring of support with satisfaction, but he had one more card to play. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Colonel Stevens? It's General Hayes. I need you to bring the ceremony to me." "Yes, I'm serious. I'm at Santos Coffee on 5th Street downtown." "No, we're not moving it to the base. We're bringing it here." Sarah overheard part of the conversation and looked at the general with confusion. "Sir, what's happening?" "Petty Officer Martinez," he said with a slight smile. "You said you couldn't afford to take time off for the ceremony. So we're bringing the ceremony to you." Within 30 minutes, the small cafe had been transformed into an impromptu military ceremony venue. Word had spread through the local military community, and active duty personnel began arriving in dress uniforms. The cafe owner, learning what was happening, immediately closed the shop to regular customers and began rearranging tables to create space for the presentation. Local news crews arrived after being tipped off by the viral social media posts. What had started as a routine morning coffee run was becoming a national story about respect, sacrifice, and the hidden heroes working among us every day. Colonel Stevens arrived with a small honor guard and the official Medal of Valor citation. As military personnel filled the cafe, Sarah found herself standing at attention for the first time in months, feeling once again like the decorated warrior she truly was, rather than the invisible service worker she had been forced to become. The general took his position at the front of the impromptu ceremony space. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to honor Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, United States Navy retired. Her actions in combat demonstrated the highest levels of courage, dedication, and selfless service to her country and her fellow service members." The formal language of military recognition filled the small cafe, lending dignity and gravity to a space that had witnessed such disrespect just an hour earlier. Sarah stood straight and proud, her military bearing returning as she was finally recognized for who she truly was. As the citation was read aloud, detailing her heroic actions in classified operations, the gathering crowd of civilians and military personnel listened in respectful silence. Many were learning for the first time about the incredible sacrifices made by the woman who had been serving their coffee with quiet dignity. The ceremony was being broadcast live on local television, and the contrast between the morning's humiliation and the current honors was not lost on viewers. Social media exploded with support for Sarah and condemnation for the businesswoman, whose prejudice had sparked the entire sequence of events. But for Sarah, standing in that transformed cafe surrounded by fellow service members and grateful civilians, the most important moment was yet to come. As the formal presentation concluded, General Hayes approached Sarah with the Medal of Valor certificate and a small velvet box containing a commemorative pin. The crowd of military personnel, civilians, and news crews watched in respectful silence as he pinned the recognition to her simple work uniform. "Petty Officer Martinez," he said in a voice that carried throughout the cafe, "your country owes you a debt that can never fully be repaid. Today we want to ensure that your service and sacrifice are properly recognized, not just by the military community, but by all Americans." Sarah accepted the honor with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the morning's events. As she shook the general's hand, cameras flashed and the crowd erupted in applause. For the first time in months, she felt truly seen and valued for who she was. The cafe owner, a middle-aged immigrant who had built his business from nothing, approached the microphone that had been set up for the ceremony. "I want to say something," he began, his voice thick with emotion and accent. "This morning I watched a customer treat my employee with disrespect and I did nothing. I was afraid to interfere, afraid of losing business. I am ashamed of my silence." He turned to face Sarah directly. "You have honored my cafe with your presence and your service. From today forward, you will never need to worry about employment. I am promoting you to general manager, with full benefits and a salary worthy of your experience. This business will be proud to be associated with an American hero." The crowd applauded again, but Sarah raised her hand for quiet. "Thank you all," she said, her voice stronger now than it had been all morning. "But I want to say something important. What happened here today wasn't just about me. It was about assumptions, about judging people by appearances, about the invisible veterans working in every community across America." She looked around the room, making eye contact with civilians and service members alike. There are thousands of veterans struggling to find work that values their skills and experience. They're driving trucks, waiting tables, working in stores, often hiding their military service because they've learned that it sometimes creates more barriers than opportunities. The news cameras focused on her as she continued, her natural leadership qualities evident to everyone present. "If this story accomplishes anything, I hope it encourages people to look deeper, to ask questions, to understand that the person serving you might have stories and experiences far beyond what you can imagine." General Hayes stepped forward again. "Petty Officer Martinez raises an excellent point. This is why the position I offered her earlier is so important. We need experienced veterans like her to help bridge the gap between military and civilian worlds, to train our active duty personnel and to serve as examples of what honorable service looks like." Sarah looked at the business card still sitting on the counter, then at the cafe owner, who had just offered her a management position, then at the general who had offered her a chance to return to work that utilized her true skills. For the first time in months, she had choices, real options that recognized her worth. "General Hayes," she said formally, "I accept your offer, but I'd like to propose a modification. Could part of my role include developing programs to help other veterans transition to civilian careers? Could we create partnerships with businesses like this cafe to provide opportunities for veterans to use their skills in the civilian workforce?" The general smiled broadly. "Petty Officer Martinez, that's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. Consider it done." As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers, job offers, and expressions of gratitude. The contrast to her morning experience was almost overwhelming. The businesswoman who had started it all never returned to the cafe. The viral videos of her behavior had consequences far beyond public embarrassment. Her own company, learning of the incident, asked her to resign rather than damage their reputation. Meanwhile, Sarah's story became a rallying point for veteran advocacy groups and led to increased awareness about the challenges faced by former service members seeking civilian employment. 6 months later, Sarah was running a successful program that had placed over 200 veterans in meaningful civilian careers. The cafe where it all started became a regular meeting place for veteran support groups, and the owner installed a permanent display honoring local military heroes. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that her service and sacrifice did matter to her fellow Americans. She had discovered that heroism isn't always recognized immediately, but when it is finally seen, it has the power to change not just individual lives, but entire communities. The ring she wore, that simple band with the trident insignia, was no longer a secret she kept hidden. It had become a symbol of pride, a conversation starter, and a reminder that true strength often comes in quiet, unassuming packages that require only recognition to shine.